In the first video, I addressed Pope Urban II's stated reasons for calling for the First Crusade, and then demonstrated that many of his reasons were either false, greatly exaggerated, or simply actions of the Mad Caliph who had been dead for 74 years. After addressing those falsities, it still left us with the question, what did prompt the First Crusade? In order to answer that, we must dig into the background of the two most important figures whose actions led to the First Crusade. We're going to get to the First Crusade itself in due time, but first, we have to understand the background. Your patience is greatly appreciated, and I believe this is well worth your time. First, let's talk about Alexius I. In 1094 or 1095, Emperor Alexius I Komnenos sent to Pope Urban II and requested aid from the west against the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuk Turks were a group of the Oghuz Turks who began to migrate into Islamic territory in the late 10th century. They adopted Sunni Islam and became the protectors of the Abbasid Caliphate that controlled the Arabian Peninsula and Persia at this time. The Seljuk Turks took Jerusalem in 1071. More importantly for our conversation, on August the 26th, 1071, the Seljuk Turks defeated the Byzantine army at the Battle of Manzikert on the eastern boundaries of the Byzantine Empire in what is eastern modern-day Turkey. The fallout of this was disastrous for the Byzantines. Civil unrest, economic crisis both weakened the empire, and it allowed the Turks to move into Anatolia. By 1080, huge amounts of territory had been taken by the Muslim invaders, and their progress would not be halted until around 1081 when Alexius I assumed control of the Byzantine Empire. But if Alexius I had been fighting the Seljuk Turks since 1081, why did he request aid from the West 13 or 14 years later? Well, let's come back to that in a moment. First, you need to know how Alexius I came to power. He served in the army, when in 1081 he led a rebellion against Emperor Nicephorus III, Botanitis, and took the throne with some help from his mother. Almost immediately, the empire was invaded in the west by the Normans. After multiple defeats, he secures an alliance with the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, more on him later, and recovered most of his losses by 1085. By the 1090s, he had turned his attention back towards the Turks in regaining his lost territory in the east. This alliance with the Holy Roman Empire was truly a case of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Remember how I told you that he came to power through a rebellion? Well, what goes around comes around. And Alexius I would face a number of coups during his reign. Before the First Crusade, he had to deal with at least 11 different conspiracies and coups, including attempts from his own nephew, his own brother-in-law, and other members of the aristocracy, the Senate, and the army. Well, not knowing who he could trust, he turned again to the west, as he had done in his fight against the Normans. And now you know why the Byzantine emperor had reached out to the Pope in the west for help in spite of the Great Schism of 1054 that split the Eastern and the Western churches. Now, I warned of plans inside of plans in my last video. Now, we're starting to see them and the impact that they had on the First Crusade. Now that we know a little bit about Alexius I, who was the emperor of the Eastern Empire, let's move to the west now and let's get some background on Pope Urban II. When the usurper Alexius I reached out to the west for aid, stating that nearly all of Anatolia had been captured by the invading Seljuk Turks, who did he reach out to? None other than Pope Urban II, a man who was also doing his best to hang on to power in the west. Pope Urban II reigned from 1088 to 1099. To fully understand Pope Urban II's motives, we need to start with his predecessor, Pope Gregory VII, and talk about something known as the investiture controversy. Hundreds of years before all of this, an earlier pope had formed the Holy Roman Empire with Charlemagne in the west to rival the Roman Empire that was now based in Constantinople. Can you imagine that? A Roman Empire that was centered outside of Rome. Well, after his death, the Holy Roman Empire became centered in what is modern-day Germany. In 1076, Pope Urban II's predecessor, Pope Gregory VII, excommunicated Emperor Henry IV for appointing bishops and abbots. The Pope could appoint emperors, but the emperor could not appoint bishops and abbots because, well, I guess just because. A year later, Emperor Henry IV would perform penance by standing barefoot in the snow and begging the Pope's forgiveness, which was received. But the bromance didn't last. In 1080, the same Henry IV installed Clement III as an antipope. For the rest of Gregory VII's reign, and for all of Urban II's reign as pope, there was a schism in the Western Church. Clement III is acting as pope in favor of the Holy Roman Emperor, and Urban II is following in Gregory VII's footsteps in trying to keep power within the papacy. This is why there is a Council of Clermont in France in 1095. For some years now, Urban II has faced difficulties even being in Rome. He spent time traveling across the south of France, southern Italy, and Sicily, drumming up support for his side. It's during this attempt to unite the Western Church and to quell this controversy that he calls for the First Crusade. And he only comes to Clermont after he secures the loyalties of the two wealthiest bishops in southern France, one of which was Adhemar of Lepi, who was given spiritual command of the First Crusade. So while the call for the First Crusade was said to be based on spiritual and heroic reasons, we've seen that both Alexius I in the East and Pope Urban II in the West both had ulterior motives for their actions. In the last video, I demonstrated that Urban II's stated reasons for calling for a crusade were largely based on false or exaggerated statements. And after these first two videos, I'm hoping that you're beginning to see that the Crusades did not begin with the best of intentions, at least not from the leadership, but rather was the result of two men's separate ambitions to hold on to and consolidate power against internal struggles and schisms. Alexius I couldn't trust his own people, so he sought the help of the West to crush his enemies. And Urban II, wanting people to stop fighting against him, and so he sought to redirect their anger towards a common enemy in the East. In the next video, we're going to look at the primary leaders of the First Crusade and see that these men, while being promised forgiveness of sins and a get out of purgatory free card, in exchange for taking the sign of the cross and going into battle against the Saracens, these men were anything but spiritual, and the treasure that they saw wasn't heavenly. It was most definitely earthly. I'm going to try to get the next 2 or 3 videos in this series out in the next few days. So stay tuned as we continue to examine why Christians should not glorify the Crusades.